Have you ever stopped to wonder, like, why exactly you do the things you do?
Oh, that's a dangerous question.
Right. But I don't mean the massive life choices. I'm not talking about why you chose your career where you live. I mean the really small, everyday habits.
Yeah, the micro decisions.
Exactly. Like, why do you listen to that specific Korean pop playlist on your morning commute? Or why did you spend your weekend watching some huge American blockbuster film?
Or why you end a stressful week by rolling out a mat to practice yoga.
Yes, exactly. What if I told you that those aren't just, random personal choices? What if your playlist, your movie tickets, your downward dog, what if all of that is actually the result of a carefully constructed, entirely invisible global force?
It's honestly a profound realization once you finally see the underlying machinery for the first time. Because, we are so conditioned to think of global conquest as something that happens on a physical battlefield, right? Or across these tense negotiating tables.
Right, guys in suits yelling at each other.
Exactly. But the reality is that an entirely different kind of conquest is happening right in your living room, just through the media you consume and the habits you form.
And our mission today is to look at the blueprints of that exact machinery. We are drawing from some phenomenal source material today. It's excerpts from The Architecture of Attraction, The Evolution of Soft Power.
It's a fascinating read.
It really is. We're going to look at how nations rewrite the rules of global politics, shape international events, and honestly influence millions of people without firing a single shot.
Which is wild to think about.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to truly understand how countries pull this off today, we have to look at the blunt force tactics they used to rely on.
Yeah, we have to start with what they call hard power. Traditionally, history is just written by hard power. These are the coercive, blunt instruments of statecraft.
The heavy hitters.
Right. For centuries, if a nation wanted to exert influence or just force another country to act, it relied on direct, visible force. Yeah. So we're talking about deploying military might, threatening violence, or leveraging massive economic weight.
Like imposing crippling sanctions or trade embargoes.
Exactly. Cutting off a country's vital resources.
So hard power is essentially the geopolitical stick. You comply because the alternative is just, too painful or destructive to your own nation's survival.
That is the core mechanism, yeah. The target nation acts in your interests, but not because they agree with your worldview. They just do it out of pure self-preservation.
Right.
But our source material highlights this massive shift in the historical paradigm. It centers on a concept formally developed by the political scientist Joseph Nye. He called it soft power.
Soft power.
Yeah. Nye argued that there's this secondary, highly potent form of influence that operates not through coercion, but through attraction.
Okay, attraction.
It operates quietly. It doesn't impose. It persuades. It uses magnetism instead of threats. The ultimate goal is engineering a scenario where other nations, and crucially, the citizens of those nations, actually want to act in alignment with your interests.
Thinking about this shift from coercion to attraction, here's an analogy that I think kind of grounds it in everyday experience.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine you are at your job. Hard power is like the terrible authoritarian boss.
Yeah, we all know the one.
Right. The kind of boss who forces you to stay at the office until 9 p.m. on a Friday by threatening to fire you if you don't finish a project.
Yep.
So you stay, and the work gets done, but you are absolutely miserable. You resent the company, and the second a competitor offers you a job, you're out the door.
That is a perfect distillation of compliance through coercion. The immediate goal is achieved, obviously, but the long-term relationship is actively degraded.
Exactly. But soft power is the visionary leader. It's the manager who articulates such a compelling mission, who creates such a fantastic supportive culture that you willingly stay until 9 p.m. on a Friday.
Because you actually care about the work.
Yes. They never issued a threat. They simply made you want to be part of the architecture they're building. You're doing the exact same work, but your internal motivation is completely different, which means your loyalty is deeply rooted.
And that shift in internal motivation changes the entire geopolitical landscape. The underlying relevance for you listening to this deep dive right now is that we live in a deeply interconnected world.
Yeah, everything is linked.
Right. A century ago, geographic borders offered physical isolation, and a massive military was your ultimate security guarantee. But today, we are bound by global supply chains, instantaneous communication networks, transnational challenges like climate change.
Exactly.
In this environment, A nation's perception is quite literally as important as its military capability. A country that is deeply admired globally finds it infinitely easier to build trade alliances, negotiate favorable treaties, and shape international narratives.
Because everyone already likes them.
Yes, hard power expends resources and generates lasting resentment. Soft power effectively recruits the rest of the world to volunteer to help you achieve your goals.
Which is a complete inversion of how we normally think about national security. But, I mean, if soft power is like that visionary leader we just talked about, the immediate question is how a country actually manufactures that dynamic.
Right, it's not easy.
It's one thing for a single manager to be charismatic. It's an entirely different logistical challenge for a nation-state of millions of people to build a globally attractive persona that reaches across oceans.
Oh, totally. But the source text breaks this down beautifully into what it calls the architecture of influence. And this architecture isn't random. It's built on three fundamental pillars.
Okay, let's break down the pillars.
The first, and arguably the most recognizable to the average person, is culture. Culture is incredibly potent as a tool of statecraft because it travels effortlessly across borders.
It doesn't need a visa.
Exactly. It doesn't require a passport. This encompasses a nation's films, music, cuisine, literature, art, and even just daily traditions.
I mean, culture is the obvious starting point because it's the most accessible, right? I might not understand a country's complex tax policies, but I can definitely appreciate their cinema or their food. It creates a baseline of familiarity.
And that baseline of familiarity is the absolute foundation of soft power. It builds a subconscious emotional connection. When people around the world consistently engage with a country's culture, they slowly, often unwittingly begin to associate that country with positive values.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so if a nation's cultural exports emphasize themes of innovation or freedom or community, the consumers of that culture start projecting those traits onto the nation itself. It builds an underlying reservoir of affinity.
But culture has to have limits, right? I mean, liking a country's pop music or enjoying their traditional dishes doesn't necessarily mean I want to live under their government or, like, support their geopolitical treaties.
No, of course not.
There has to be a structural element to this architecture to translate that affinity into actual power.
And that brings us directly to the second pillar, which is political values. This centers on a nation's internal governance and how it treats its own citizens, because the global community watches that closely.
Right.
Does the country have a demonstrable commitment to democratic principles? Is there a reliable, transparent rule of law? Do they respect basic human rights? Is their institutional framework stable?
Because countries that project an image of being just, fair, and principled command a tremendous amount of respect globally.
Absolutely. And that respect translates into tangible influence. Foreign nations and foreign investors are much more likely to align themselves with systems they view as morally legitimate and institutionally reliable.
I mean, nobody wants to publicly ally their economy or their reputation with a deeply corrupt or unstable regime if they can avoid it. It's just too risky.
Precisely. Which leads to the third pillar, foreign policy credibility. This is the most directly strategic dimension of the three. It measures how consistently and ethically a country behaves on the broader global stage.
Like, are they reliable diplomatic partners who actually honor their agreements?
Yes. Do they step up to provide humanitarian assistance during crises? Do they contribute to international peacekeeping efforts? A nation that is viewed as a constructive, stabilizing force in the world gains immense trust from its peers.
Okay, so the architecture relies on culture to build the emotional connection, internal political values to build respect, and foreign policy credibility to build trust.
You've got it.
But I want to look at how these pillars actually function in the wild. Like, how do they practically translate into getting another sovereign nation to act in your favor?
Well, what's fascinating here is the mechanism of how these pillars operate in practice. The text describes it as a slow, gradual chain reaction.
A chain reaction.
Yeah. It begins simply with exposure. You encounter a country's cultural export. Perhaps you watch a television series produced overseas. Over time, repeated positive exposure leads to admiration.
Okay.
You begin to appreciate the aesthetics, the storytelling, or the values embedded in that content. And with enough time and consistency, that admiration matures into trust.
So the sequence is exposure to admiration to trust. And then what?
Once trust is firmly established, it fosters alignment. You naturally start to give weight to their broader worldview. And finally, that alignment translates into true influence.
Wow.
The critical element to understand is that this multi-stage process operates completely invisibly to the average consumer. But unlike a military intervention, which might yield immediate compliance but leaves a legacy of hostility, this soft power chain reaction creates deep, enduring impressions.
It shapes the default assumptions of entire future generations.
Exactly.
Okay, I have to push back on this chain reaction a bit. I understand the psychological progression, sure, but how does this actually move from the individual to the geopolitical?
What do you mean?
Like, does my personal admiration for a country's cultural exports actually restrict or enable what my government can do? If I love Japanese technology and anime, does that actually give Japan leverage over my country's trade policies? Or is culture just like a pleasant Trojan horse that simply gets them a meeting with the trade minister?
It's an excellent challenge. And the Trojan horse analogy isn't quite right because it implies deception. Soft power isn't about tricking a foreign population. It's about reducing systemic friction.
Reducing friction. Okay.
Think of it as a political shield. When a population deeply admires another country's culture, their local politicians face massive domestic resistance if they try to enact hostile policies against that country.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right. If a government tries to impose heavy tariffs or sanctions on a nation whose products, music, and films are beloved by its own citizens, those politicians risk serious voter backlash. The culture effectively ties the hands of foreign policymakers.
Because the people won't stand for it.
Exactly. Conversely, if a deeply admired country proposes a complex international treaty, the foreign public's default stance is curiosity and open-mindedness rather than suspicion. It lowers the defensive walls, making diplomatic success significantly more likely.
That is a massive insight. The culture creates a buffer. It's like the benefit of the doubt operating on a macroeconomic scale.
Exactly.
So the blueprints for this make total sense in theory. But looking at the case studies in our source material, it's clear there is no one-size-fits-all playbook. Countries build this architecture in wildly different ways. Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's look at the historical heavyweight in this space. The United States.
The United States is perhaps the most prominent historical practitioner of comprehensive soft power. While it obviously possesses immense military capability and economic weight, its true global reach throughout the 20th century was cemented by unparalleled cultural dominance. Hollywood, absolutely. We're talking about the global proliferation of films, the eventual rise of technology platforms originating in Silicon Valley, and a network of elite educational institutions. All of these combined to project an incredibly potent image of the American lifestyle.
They were actively exporting the American dream as a strategic asset.
That is exactly how it functioned. They projected an image of relentless innovation, individualism, and limitless economic opportunity. And this wasn't merely entertainment for the masses, it was a highly effective geopolitical tool.
Because people wanted to be part of it.
Yes. This cultural projection actively siphoned the brightest global talent, who wanted to study and work in the environment they saw on screen. It attracted massive foreign investment.
Right, and during the Cold War.
Yes. During the Cold War, the appeal of American consumer culture and personal freedom served as a stark, attractive contrast to the Soviet model. It aligned vast portions of the globe with U.S. interests without requiring military intervention. People wanted to emulate the American model because the cultural projection made it look inherently desirable.
But then you look at South Korea, which the text highlights as a masterclass in modern attraction, and their approach is entirely different.
Completely different.
I mean, the U.S. had an absolute economic empire to back its cultural exports. South Korea emerged from a devastating war in the 1950s without vast natural resources, an enormous landmass, or a dominant military. Yet they made a highly deliberate strategic investment in a global cultural wave.
The Hallyu wave.
Yes. They poured state and private resources into developing their music industry, refining their cinema, and exporting digital content.
What is remarkable about South Korea's model is that it enhanced its global influence entirely independent of traditional hard power metrics. They engineered a global phenomenon.
It's incredible.
They didn't threaten anyone to secure a seat at the international table, nor did they use economic coercion. They simply manufactured cultural content that was so highly polished and undeniably attractive that the global market demanded it.
Pure execution of the first pillar.
Exactly. And crucially, it translated directly into economic power. The massive popularity of Korean entertainment elevated the perceived value of Korean consumer goods. A consumer who loves K-pop is significantly more likely to purchase a Korean smartphone or vehicle. Their cultural soft power actively drives their export-heavy, hard economy.
It's just a brilliant strategy. And then there's China, which the sources note uses a much more blended, structured model. They aren't just relying on pop culture to win hearts and minds.
No, China represents a complex hybrid approach. They certainly invest in projecting their traditional culture and language globally, frequently establishing cultural institutions and language programs in foreign universities. But they pair this cultural outreach directly with shaping geopolitical narratives through massive, tangible infrastructure projects.
The Belt and Road kind of stuff.
Exactly. Through initiatives in developing nations across Asia, Africa, and beyond, they build ports, highways, and telecommunications networks. Their approach demonstrates an acute awareness of how perception intertwines with economic utility.
It's an observation that really stands out when you compare the case studies. The sheer contrast in these flavors of influence.
Oh, for sure.
You look at South Korea's rise, and it feels purely cultural. It's joyful, consumer-driven, highly emotional. Then you look at China's approach, and it is heavily structured, systematic, and deeply rooted in physical infrastructure. How do those different flavors of influence actually feel to the countries on the receiving end?
They feel profoundly different because they target entirely different aspects of the human and national experience. South Korea's soft power targets the individual citizen's desire for entertainment, aesthetics, and community belonging. It builds a highly emotional grassroots affection.
And China's
blended model targets the developing nation's fundamental desire for modernization, economic stability, and tangible progress. It builds a pragmatic reliance. A newly built bridge is a physical manifestation of reliability. The goal is that this pragmatic reliance eventually evolves into deep diplomatic trust.
That is such a distinct difference.
Both nations aim for global alignment, but the psychological path they engineer to get there is completely distinct.
We also have to talk about India, which the text brings up as a unique case. India is sitting on an incredibly deep well of civilizational roots.
Thousands of years of history.
Right. We're talking about profound philosophical traditions, concepts like yoga, Ayurveda, and deep spiritual traditions that have been almost universally embraced by the globe. Add to that a massive, highly successful diaspora that acts as a network of human bridges everywhere they settle. Plus the sheer scale of the Bollywood film industry and the global love for Indian cuisine.
India's foundation for soft power is arguably one of the most robust on the planet because of that deep historical resonance.
Yeah.
The ongoing challenge, as identified in the source material, is not a lack of attractive cultural assets.
No, they have plenty of that.
The challenge lies in the deliberate structuring and scaling of this influence. How does a modern nation-state take thousands of years of organic, decentralized cultural appeal and translate it into a coherent, strategic foreign policy advantage? It requires transitioning from passive cultural appreciation to active geopolitical leverage.
Looking at all these distinct strategies, the U.S. projecting the American dream, Korea manufacturing a cultural wave, China building infrastructure, India leaning on civilizational history, it begs a serious question. In today's chaotic, fast-paced geopolitical landscape, is just being attractive enough? Because honestly, watching the news, it feels like the global environment is getting sharper and more aggressive, not softer.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we arrive at a critical evolution in international relations. The concept of smart power.
Smart power.
Yes. The harsh reality is that no nation can survive purely on attraction, just as no nation can thrive purely on coercion in the long term. Smart power is the strategic realization that the most successful nations integrate both hard and soft power effectively.
So it's a mix.
Right. They maintain the hard power capability, the military strength and economic resilience to defend their borders and deter immediate threats. But they lead with soft power to build wide-ranging alliances, foster goodwill, and drastically reduce the scenarios where they actually need to deploy that force.
So you use the soft power to build the coalition and lower the defensive walls, and you keep the hard power quietly in the background as the ultimate insurance policy.
Exactly. And this integration is crucial because of the modern battlefield we now find ourselves navigating. We're living in a multipolar digital age. The rise of instantaneous global communication and information warfare has fundamentally altered how power operates.
This is a whole new game.
Global narratives are no longer exclusively decided by a handful of diplomats negotiating in a closed room. They are contested in real time, 24 hours a day, on digital platforms visible to billions.
And a single viral video recorded on a smartphone can completely upend a high-level diplomatic summit or derail a carefully negotiated trade agreement.
Precisely. Public opinion, both domestic and international, now exerts immediate, intense pressure on policy decisions. A government simply cannot provide material support to an allied nation if its own citizens are watching real-time footage of that ally acting abhorrently online.
The voter backlash would be instantaneous.
Exactly. This means that modern countries are no longer just competing for physical territory or natural resources. They are locked in a relentless, minute-by-minute competition for attention, credibility, and moral legitimacy.
Which actually levels the playing field significantly, doesn't it?
It does.
Historically, if you didn't have a massive army or a GDP in the trillions, you were a minor player. But if modern influence is deeply tied to perception, virality, and digital narratives, a smaller nation with a brilliant digital strategy and highly engaging cultural exports can exert immense influence. They can punch way above their traditional geopolitical weight class.
It absolutely democratizes influence to a certain degree. But navigating this digital landscape, this raises an important question regarding strategy. Can this digital soft power be artificially manufactured?
Oh, that's a good point.
If a government realizes they are facing a deficit in global trust, can they simply hire a massive public relations firm, allocate $1 billion, and build soft power from scratch?
Can they?
The source text is very explicit on this point. While governments can strategically invest in cultural diplomacy, fund international broadcasters, and subsidize their arts sectors, the core of the projection must remain authentic.
So you can amplify the signal, but you cannot fake the source material.
You cannot fake it. True soft power must be inextricably rooted in genuine values and consistent domestic behavior. If there's a visible gap between the utopian image a country projects outward and the harsh reality of how it actually behaves inward or toward its neighbors, it will inevitably be exposed. And when it is, it instantly destroys their global credibility.
Which brings up a profound vulnerability regarding those viral digital platforms we were just discussing. In an environment where information moves at the speed of light, how quickly can decades of carefully constructed soft power evaporate if a country is caught acting hypocritically on the global stage?
It can evaporate in a matter of days. Soft power is an incredibly asymmetric asset. It requires decades of consistent, principled behavior, high-quality cultural output, and steady diplomacy to build genuine global trust. But it requires only a single highly visible act of hypocrisy, cruelty, or institutional failure to shatter it completely.
Because in the digital age, everyone holds a camera.
And every action is subjected to global scrutiny. If a nation preaches the sanctity of human rights, but is documented violating them, or projects an image of steadfast stability but descends into visible internal chaos, the global audience registers the dissonance immediately.
And the trust is gone.
And once that fundamental credibility is lost, the chain reaction of influence we discussed earlier violently reverses course. Admiration turns to active disgust, trust turns to deep suspicion, and political alignment turns to vocal opposition.
So, what does this all mean for us as we synthesize these sources? The ultimate takeaway seems to be that the very nature of global power has experienced a seismic shift over the last century. We have transitioned from a world where blunt dominance was the only currency that mattered to a highly interconnected world where influence is king.
Influence is absolutely king.
The focus has moved from coercion to attraction.
It is a fundamental shift from commanding control to cultivating alignment. The ability to inspire others, to shape their preferences, and to draw them toward your vision of the future is proving to be just as critical, if not more vital, than the ability to compel them through force.
And what's truly remarkable is that you, listening to this deep dive right now, are an active participant in this matrix.
You really are.
The next time you decide to stream a foreign movie on a Friday night, or try a new international restaurant in your neighborhood, or download a video game developed by a studio halfway across the world, you aren't just acting as a passive consumer. You are actively participating in the global architecture of soft power. You are the specific target audience in a grand, invisible strategy of global attraction.
Influence in the 21st century will increasingly depend on the curation of perception. The nations that thrive in the coming decades will be the ones that understand how to architect that perception authentically and how to maintain the delicate balance of smart power.
And that leaves us with one final, slightly mind-bending thought to mull over as we wrap up. Throughout this deep dive, we've explored how genuine human connection, authentic culture, and lived political values shape this invisible force. But what happens to the architecture of attraction as we move deeper into the era of artificial intelligence? If soft power fundamentally relies on shaping human perceptions and cultural narratives, what happens when AI begins to automatically generate our cultural content? When algorithms can flawlessly translate media in real time, or when machine learning dictates exactly what digital feeds we see on our screens?
That changes everything.
It really does. Will the future of global soft power belong to the country that organically produces the most compelling, authentic human culture? Or will the ultimate influence belong to the country that designs the algorithms deciding which culture you and I are allowed to see? We started this conversation examining the invisible forces that dictate why you listen to the music you do. As technology rapidly advances, those invisible forces are only going to become more complex, more integrated, and significantly harder to see. Think about that the next time you put on your headphones.
Thank you for joining us on this Strategic Vanguard podcast. If you found value in this analysis, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We bring you fresh podcasts every Monday here on YouTube and Rumble, and you can also catch the audio versions on Spotify and Amazon Music. Just search for Strategic Vanguard Podcast. For more insights, articles, and discussions, subscribe to our blog at strategicvanguard.com. Your support helps us grow and bring you more in-depth analysis on defense, geopolitics, and strategy. Until next time, stay informed, stay strategic.